Hi everyone, I've just got a few thoughts about helping your students get ready for independent practice. This is part of the level 3 teacher training and I just wanted to talk a little bit about it. I think it's very important to be organised and systematic about how you approach this with your students. Often the kids, maybe when they're teenagers, maybe a little bit younger, will get to the stage where they're suddenly like, okay, I don't want to practice with my parent anymore, and they will just kind of take it in hand themselves. So as many of you will know, one of my big things is that we need to talk a lot about practice, make sure that you have a good understanding of what's happening at home, ask them if they're getting through what you've asked them to do, ask them how the vibe is. All of those things will mean that you know whether your student has suddenly jumped off the cliff before it all starts to maybe demonstrate itself in more negative ways. So I think once you get to the stage, for my students, it tends to be either around book 4, 5, regardless of how old they are, unless they're very young, or around the age of 13, 14, sometimes a bit younger. But I think if my students are still practicing with parents, unless they have special needs or there's some particular circumstance that means it's really important for them to continue working together, by the time they get to 14, I'm trying to start the process of them practicing independently, even if they're not super keen on it, because I'd like to get in there first before they become really cross with their parent and feel like they just are being babied. And unless the parent is a violinist themselves, mostly by the time they're certainly the middle of book 5, they're not actually helping with very much technical information anyway, so I think that's a good time to start the process of being more independent as well. Once the students are practicing independently, I do say to the parent and the child that will mean the child comes to the lesson, or the student by this point, not maybe a child, comes to the lesson by themselves. And we will kind of make a point of inviting the parent to come and listen to a certain thing that the student might want to show them, or they might have a concert coming up and I might say, okay, let's play it to them to get ready for the solo or get ready for the group concert, something like that. But the understanding is that our relationship has gone from the Suzuki triangle of student, parent and child back to, or developed into a more two-way situation where it's me, a teacher, and the student, and the parent becomes less involved. So I think the process that I have kind of come to use over many years is a really good one. And like I said, I talk about it a lot of time before it starts. Often the students are being supervised by the parent. At this point, the parent is helping them get through what I've set, making sure that they've done it, making sure that they're trying at the points at which they might feel a bit more resistant to making an effort because it's too difficult or they don't like it, whatever. Often the parent is supervising practice but not really helping with the actual content very much. Might just be making sure that they're getting through what I've set at this point, depending on how musical the parent is themselves, whether they're actually very helpful in any other way or not is depends on the circumstances. But I think it's easy to underestimate how helpful it is for the student to have the parent there, even if they hardly understand anything of what they're doing. So the first thing we talk about is, okay, when you feel that you're ready, both of you, it's about the adult as well as the child, to start thinking about practicing independently, I'm going to set you parts of practice each week for a few weeks, maybe even for a few months, and you're going to be responsible, the student, for those parts, and the parent is going to leave you in the room by yourself. So their only role in that, at that time, that part of the practice, is to make sure that you understand what you're supposed to be doing. And over time, that becomes more independent again, that you say, okay, I'm ready to do this by myself, rather than a parent saying, you're going to do this, 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 and this. I'm going to leave you to it now. But I think that's a really good way to start. And mostly I start with the review, and the child or the student will do their review by themselves. We will be talking in the practice about what they're going to focus on in those review pieces. And so everybody has a really good understanding of what responsibility each person has, that the parent understands that it's their responsibility to go away and not get involved, even if they hear what they think is not very good practice on review. Christine Goodner makes a really brilliant point in her blog that it might not be as efficient as it was when you were practicing with your parent, but what we are looking for is not to build efficiency in practice, but to build independent people. And so for your teenager, it's much more important for them to learn how to work independently of you, because one day you won't be even in the same house as them, rather than for them to practice their, Vivaldi G minor with perfect ringing threes on each ringing note, or whatever it is that they're focusing on. So parents must be really clear and understand and buy into the idea that the practice quality may go down, but the reason for that is because they're learning different skills throughout this time. And once they've finished learning those skills, then they can think about the efficiency, and then it will all come together beautifully in an ideal world at the end. So I start with reviews. Most of my students at this kind of level are playing 3 or 4 review pieces each practice. I will talk to them in the lesson about what they're going to focus on, whether they're going to do some boxes for that review piece, practice spots, or whether they're going to play through it, whether they're going to have the music or not, whether they might be preparing something for an orchestra or a concert. That stuff is the first thing that I give my students responsibility for. And I will kind of make a big deal in the lessons where the parent still is coming in of asking the parent if they felt that they did a good job in standing down, because it's really difficult for a parent who's been helping their student for maybe 10 years by this point. Every practice they've been involved, it's really hard for them to step away and listen to things that they think might not be done in the best way possible, and not to get involved. So I asked the student whether they thought their parent was doing that well. I asked the student, the parent, whether they felt okay with it, and then I will offer extra support, ways to do that. Plug in your headphones, listen to a podcast, put on a timer and go and see your child in 15 minutes. Literally, if you aren't supposed to be involved, you don't actually need to know what they're doing, because the whole point is that you're not going to help them with that. That's between me and the student. Or, depending on who's at home, go for a walk, whatever. There are ways to help the parents let go, which can be the most difficult part of this process, I think, for lots of families. At this point, the parent's role is still to remind the student when they're supposed to be practicing, encourage them into doing their practice, make sure that they're doing their listening. They haven't just gone overnight into being an independent person who puts on their recordings every day, who does all of their practice by themselves without being reminded, etc. So we start with the review, then we might add in the orchestra pieces, scales and arpeggios, sight reading, and then the last thing is usually the working piece. And often the students really want help with that, because they understand that that's going to get them onto the next piece, or that's their kind of new focus rather than older focuses of review, scales and sight reading. So they do their boxes and play through of the working piece with their parent for quite a long time. And then we will work on, again, a gradual retreat kind of idea of, okay, this week you're going to do your boxes by yourself, but mum's going to listen or dad's going to listen and see whether they agree that you did it the right way. And that's not for you to then find out from them, the student. That's for me, the teacher, to find out from the parent, how did you think it was going? And I also make a big deal of talking to the student about how it was. Like, how was it to do your boxes without your parent saying yes or no, that one counts or that one doesn't count? How did you feel about that? Did you find that you actually just didn't know whether you needed to do it again or not? Or did you feel like, yep, I knew, but I couldn't be bothered? Or did you feel like, yes, I knew and I made sure I did it right? And I really try to keep all of those kind of conversations about that non-judgmental, that I'm not looking for you to tell me that you couldn't be bothered and that's something I'm going to blame you for. But if you did feel that you couldn't be bothered, then we need to look at ways that you can encourage yourself, because you are now going to be practicing independently, to make sure you've done that. Some kids really like a tick chart, so we make sure that they tick everything off, so that they'll see a glaring hole if they've missed something out. Other students want to have, 10 pennies on the floor and push one over with their foot every time they've done a good a good box. There are loads of ways that we can kind of incorporate encouragements for themselves that they can use without their parent being there. And then so eventually it will get to the stage where the practice is happening entirely independently, but the parent is still telling them when they need to do their practice, reminding them about their listening, maybe putting the listening on still, depends where that happens. And that phase can last for quite a long time, I think, maybe some of my late teenagers, 16, 17-year-olds, their parents are still saying, have you done your practice? You need to go and do it now, whatever. But obviously it's a really important part of being able to motivate yourself to do the work that you have taken on as an adult, that you can timetable it and make space for it. And this is something that's reflected in their schoolwork, that, you know, hopefully the parents are becoming less and less like, you need to do your homework now, and more like, have you done it? And then eventually, once you're at university, your parents don't really have that kind of interaction with you about how the work's going. They just check in, like, how are you feeling, how is it going, but they're not telling you when you're supposed to be doing it. And so I will talk to the parents and the students again, and by this point the parent's not in the lesson, so this would be like, let's invite the parent in and have a conversation about the last stage, which is you taking responsibility, where parents don't even remind you that you're supposed to be doing it. And at that point, that can be the stage where some parents feel like, well, obviously they don't want to do it because they're not doing their 6 practices a week or whatever. It can drop off, and I'm really keen for the parents to understand that it's a very important part of the process for them to realise how easy it is to forget, and for them to start timetabling their own practice and taking responsibility for making sure it's happened. And that the parent has got to step out of that part, because otherwise the relationship between me and my student, which is the one where I want them to take responsibility for what they're doing, is still actually with the invisible parent who's no longer in the room. And so I will talk to them a lot about, you might feel that your student has only done 2 practices a week and suddenly this is a waste of money. But if they do want to keep doing it, and I think they will, we will build up from that twice a week. So, because sometimes what happens is the practice drops off and they realise what a difference it makes, and then they think, okay, I definitely don't want that. My best friend in group has learnt a whole new piece and I'm still on the piece before, or, you know, it's going to take me so long to get to country dance, which I can't wait to play, or whatever it is. Maybe they've got a concert coming up and they don't feel ready for it, early enough because they haven't been doing enough practice. So all of these things are ways that the students can learn from their own experience, rather than from the parents saying to them, come on, darling, you've got to do your practice, otherwise X, Y, and Z thing will happen. And we won't be able to tell why the student is doing it until that kind of instruction from the parent has been removed. And of course, when the kid leaves home to go to, maybe music college, maybe university, maybe something else, the parent's not going to be there. So we have to keep the long-term view in mind, that if you want to have a child who becomes an adult with good self-motivation, self-discipline, the ability to put their minds to the work that they've got to do, deadline meeting, all of these things that are brilliant results of having learnt music as a child, even if you don't become a musician in whatever way you mean a musician, somebody who still plays music. All of those things are so important. And if you are an 18 or 19-year-old whose parent is still telling you when to practice, you haven't practiced the skill of actually making sure that you're going to do the work and where you're going to do it without someone holding your hand. And then when you do leave home, whatever age that is, you haven't built that skill, and that's when it can all come apart. And by that point, you also probably don't have a violin teacher, and so the safety net's completely gone, and that just seems really sad to me. So I think it's much more important to try and train the parents out of helping the kids while they've got maybe 3, 4, maybe even 5 years left of being in full-time education, living at home with a parent or parents, having a weekly lesson with the teacher. And so you can take your time with that. So much of the benefit of the Suzuki approach is that we've got all of this time. If we're going to teach these kids for 14, 15 years, there is time and space for lots of things not to go right first time without it being a problem. And so that's what's really brilliant about this. If you're starting to think about these things when the child is 12, 13, maybe 14, and then a year later, the parent is still telling them to do their practice but not involved, and then 6 months after that, the parent is no longer telling them to, and maybe they have 6 months where they're only practicing 2 or 3 times a week, but then you've still got years to come to a better solution and help your students learn the skills that they need to do their independent practice fully without any help from the parents. And that is one of the big things that will set them up for life in whatever they choose to do. It's not about the violin, it's about all of those skills of planning, self-discipline, meeting deadlines, etc. And as long as you help them and keep them safe through that whole process, then they will come out at 18 with all those skills, which is a brilliant part of what we offer to our students and their families.